Well, while they're headed back, if you want to turn in your Bibles to 2 Corinthians 8, 1 through 15, we read that earlier today. We are beginning a 4-week study of 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and chapter 9 with the hope of being inspired to be more generous. This series is called Contagious Generosity. And so we are sort of going to go, what some people might say, from preaching to meddling. You know, we're going to be talking about your giving. And so we are going to be talking about how we do that and why we do that and those kinds of things. I know there's some people who go like, man, I don't want to go to church. They're always talking about opening up your wallet and that kind of stuff. We don't always talk about that. But in this series, we want God to help us be more like Him. Our God is a generous God. These chapters come from the second letter that Paul had sent to the believers in ancient Corinth. And he directed them, and what he told them to do back then really does apply to us today. Paul said that his whole purpose in writing this section of this letter to them is he wanted them to hear and wanted to make known to them the grace of God. And so I want you to keep that in mind, that as we study this part of it and the things it talks to us, is that one of the things that's supposed to be revealed to us is God's grace. Paul did this first by sharing the story of the generosity of believers that lived in an area called Macedonia. The story about someone else's generosity can inspire us to be generous, and then the story of our own generosity can inspire others to be generous. And in this way, generosity really is contagious. In fact, I think generosity is probably more contagious than COVID. I know we kind of get worried about COVID, right? You know, you're like, oh man, I might catch it, so we got to put our masks on, maybe, we wash our hands, we do all kinds of stuff because we don't want to catch that stuff. Well, I'm just going to tell you now, generosity is contagious. So if you're one of those persons that's really guarded with your finances, and you're really guarded with your time, and you're really guarded with all the things that God has given you, and you just think, hey, I'm doing everything that I need to do, and don't talk to me anymore. I just want to warn you. Generosity is contagious, and you just might catch more than you realize, and it may make you, it just might make you more like God. When we move from the desire to be generous to actually giving something away to someone in need, we really do start to make a difference in other people's lives. And who doesn't want to make a real difference? Of course, it always helps to have something in order to give, right? It's hard to be generous if you don't have anything. And the believers in ancient Corinth had more than enough to give. So I want to tell you a little bit about ancient Corinth. Ancient Corinth was a really prosperous city for their area. I mean, they were sort of the wealthy people in their neck of the woods. And Paul wanted them to recognize that their abundance was not because of their being self-made. Their abundance was from God. And in these chapters, he really sort of answers the question, why has God given me so much? And some of us here in Los Alamos might have to deal with that same question. We look at our life, we look at all the stuff going on, and we may have to ask, well, God, why have you given us so much? I mean, we got a lot more than we can need. I don't know how you are about that. I mean, some people really are just trying to save money, and we often get calls. I mean, if you live in a place that's prosperous, people call and say, hey, we want to help you get rid of some of your money. And so I had a brother-in-law once. He got one of those phone calls, you're trying to get rid of those guys. And so this guy calls up and he says, hey, we want to help you save your money. We want you to help save money. If you just use our products and you buy our products, we're going to help you save a lot of money. And Mark responded, goes like, oh man, I don't want anybody to help me save money. I got so much money, I'm trying to get rid of it. So I don't need your product. Guy didn't know what to do or say to him, because what do you tell someone who's saying like, oh no, I've got plenty. In fact, I got too much. I'm trying to figure out how to get rid of it. I don't know if you feel that way when you look at the abundance that God has given you, but I'll just tell you now, you can't outgive God. Paul points out that those who were living in ancient Corinth were infinitely better, financially speaking, than the believers who were in Jerusalem at that time. Their country was struggling under the burden of a huge famine. And Paul wanted these Corinthians to consider their brothers and sisters in Christ back in Jerusalem, and he just challenged them. He wanted to say, well, what do you think you ought to do about it? Jerusalem's way, way far away, but do you have any responsibility to your brothers and sisters in Christ there? And he let the Spirit work on their hearts. Some of them may have wondered, well, is it really a need? Are they really having a famine? Or is this some kind of a scam? I mean, we don't want to be scammed, right? We don't want to end up giving to people who don't really have a need. I don't know if you ever get caught into that. And like those guys that are standing on the corner every time you go somewhere. I mean, I want to help. In fact, I was down in Albuquerque the other night, and it was late night. We were going through McDonald's to pick up something. There's one of those guys kind of through the line. He's got his sign and everything. It's like I ended up giving him a couple of dollars because, I mean, you feel like you got to do something. But there's always a part of me saying, is this a scam? Is this guy like, making a bunch of money and driving off somewhere? I mean, you hear those stories, but I think they're probably few and far between. I think most of those people are pretty desperate. Well, it was a real famine in Jerusalem. We know that looking back in history, there was a Roman historian called Tacitus, and he noted that back in the year 46 and 47 AD, when Paul was writing this letter, that there was a severe famine in all of Syria, which is what they refer to the Jerusalem area. And there was a Jewish historian, a guy named Josephus, who said that the famine was so bad in that area that actually thousands of people were dying because they didn't have food. It's kind of like when we hear about something like in Ethiopia. I mean, it's far away. You hear people are starving and they're dying. But sometimes we don't ever get to that point of saying, should I do something about it? Josephus actually reported about a queen, Helena, who was from, I can never say her town, Adabene. It's Adiabene. You might be able to say it better than me, but she just happened to have planned sort of a vacation visit to go to Jerusalem and see the wonders of the area. And whenever she got there, she was amazed at the famine. Her state was part of the Persian Empire at the time, and when she got there and she saw the people suffering, she realized that she had a lot of wealth to be able to go on this trip and be there. And so she did a couple of things. One of the first things she did is that she sent some of her attendants to the city of Alexandria over in Egypt to buy as much grain as they could buy and bring it back to Jerusalem. And then she sent other attendants up to Cyprus and to buy as many dried figs as they could get and bring them back and to distribute them in the Jerusalem area. And because of her generosity, there are a lot of non-biblical texts that talk about how generous this woman was, who showed up and who was moved by what she saw and did something about it. When she got back home, she informed her son, who was sort of the guy who was running the country at the time, and he sent another large gift to Jerusalem to help with the famine situation. The help that was sent to Jerusalem was received by the leaders in Jerusalem, and they distributed that help through the synagogues. The synagogues were kind of like their community centers. That's where everybody met. That's where they worshiped at. That's where they lived at. That's where they had life at. But the early church, the people who were believers in Christ, had been thrown out of the synagogues. They weren't allowed in them. And so these people who were getting some help through the synagogues, the Christians were getting no help. And that's whenever the church realized that if we're going to help the people of the church is going to have to help the people of the church. Because what little help is coming in isn't getting to them. That's why Paul, whenever he was also sharing the gospel and these new churches were raising up, he was saying, hey, one of these first things you do when you come to Christ is you got to have God's generosity. And there are these people that are brothers and sisters in Christ, and they're in an area where they're starving to death. And there is nobody helping them. When the believers in Corinth first heard about it, they were moved by compassion to help, just like you would be. Sort of like whenever we see those pictures of people suffering because of some natural disaster or some war. I mean, right now we see the things going on in Ukraine, and there's a part that's going like, what can we do to help those people? We want to do something, and we've figured out some ways through our church to get some help there, right? We've got some missions over that way. We want to say, gosh, what can we do? We know someone who has family there. Can we help her? What can we do? And if we were to hear that, hey, the Red Cross is over there and they're helping, except for they're not helping believers. They're not helping Christians. That might spur us to want to help Christians. And that's what these early believers in Corinth were hearing. Hey, there's a lot of help that's kind of coming into Jerusalem, and they're helping people, but it's not getting to people in the church because of their faith. And so the church has said, man, we've got to do something about that. However, we find from Paul that while the ancient believers in Corinth immediately said, man, we got to do something, we got to help, they never got to the helping part. They never made their collections. They never sent it on their way. And so Paul was writing this portion of his letter to sort of sow the seeds of contagious generosity so that they would get past whatever was holding them up and they would actually get to the doing part. He did this, as I mentioned earlier, by reporting about the generosity of the Macedonian churches. In comparison to the church in Corinth, those in Macedonia were financially impoverished. They didn't have much. In fact, they had very little. Yet they had the same level of compassion for the believers in Jerusalem. Paul testified how the believers in Macedonia had put a plan into action and actually started taking collection, and they collected more than Paul expected from them. They didn't just give from their ability, and they didn't just give from their abundance. They gave of their own volition, and they gave from their own poverty. That is, they gave from their own accord. The Greek word that gets translated in that verse is a word that means of their own self-will. No one was forcing them. No one was, making them feel guilty. It was not some duty they had to perform. It was not a requirement of the law. They heard about the need and were using that agape kind of love that God gives us, and probably being poor themselves. If you've ever been in a tough situation and you hear about someone else being in that same tough situation, you feel a little compassion. And you go, man, I know what it's like not to have food. I want to help those people now that I have something I can do. And even though they only had a little bit, they began to help. Paul mentions that they actually begged him for the opportunity to help. Hey, Paul, we heard about you're going to be taking this collection, and can we help? We want to help. It almost gives the idea that Paul knew that these guys were pretty poor themselves and they had barely enough to get by, and so maybe he was really just sort of asking them to do some non-financial help. It almost gives that impression. Maybe he was just saying, can you just pray for the people in Jerusalem? We know you don't really have any money, but could you just pray for them? And they were saying, we're going to pray for them, absolutely. We're going to pray for them, but can we do more? Can't we give too? And what they ended up doing is what we would call sacrificial giving. They chose to give out of their poverty. How do you give when you don't have anything? You have to give up something that you actually need. You have to give up something that you could use in order to give it to someone who has even less. And that's the example that Paul was holding up to the Corinthians. They had these Macedonians who had nothing, and they were going to have to sacrifice in order to give. Paul admitted that the Macedonians' generosity actually surprised him. He expected them probably to divert their regular givings to support this famine relief. We only have so much, and we usually give it here, and you want us to give it there, so we're just going to change it. But that's not what they did. They first gave to the Lord, which means that they took care of their own congregational needs. They had their own poor. They had their own things that they had to support. They even supported Paul like a missionary. And they took care of all of their needs first, and then they gave to the support of Jerusalem beyond that. You might remember the first gathering of the church, which was in Jerusalem, after they received the Holy Spirit on the day of Pentecost. They became known, according to Acts 2:42, for 4 different things. When this first church got together, they got known for breaking bread, that is, observing the Lord's Supper like we did today. They were known for praying and helping people through prayer. They were known for devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching and learning from it. And it says that they were also known for fellowship. I don't know what fellowship means to you, but it probably meant something different to them. Fellowship was not a term for a social gathering. That's how we use it. We got a fellowship hall. What do you do in a fellowship hall? Well, you get together and you fellowship, right? You sort of have a meal, or you play games, or that's fellowship. But that's really not what the word meant back then. Koinonia is the term. Ko together, oinos, to have together, to house together. It gets translated fellowship, but it meant to share or to have in common, and it was actually a business term. There are some non-biblical texts from that time that were used by Romans whenever they would make an agreement. And so there would be like several suppliers, and there would be a Roman person who wanted to have a lot of supply. They wanted to buy a bunch. And they were saying, we want, whatever it is. We want to buy 1,000 of these things. And they would go to people who are supplying those things, and they would say, well, we can only supply 100. And so they would talk about having koinonia with other people who could supply. And so they would have, this group could give 100, this one could give 400, that could give 500. And they would koinonia together until they had enough to meet the business transaction so that they could do that whole 1,000. That's what koinonia was. That was what fellowship was. It was taking what little you had, adding it to what someone else had, so that you could meet a greater need than what you could do on your own. That's fellowship. That's koinonia. That's what that early church was known for. You see, they had a lot of people that came together, and they had a lot of needs that was more than any one of them could do, and they shared in common to meet everyone's need. Fellowship is how each person's offering to the Lord is combined together to meet the needs of the church and beyond the needs of the church. These are collected by the local church, they're distributed by the local church, and they're used to do the work of the Lord by the local church. But we have more than what we can need, and so out of our abundance, we help other things. They didn't have buildings to pay for like we do. They didn't have insurance premiums to pay, or utility bills, or expenses to cover water, or air conditioning, or all the kinds of stuff that we like around here. We had poor people, we helped that as well, but they had a lot of people, especially in the Jerusalem church, who didn't have anything. They weren't even eating. And so they were saying, how can we take what the God has given us so that we can help feed them and we can help take care of these expenses? And yes, they even included into their funds paying someone like myself who could be full-time in the service. That was part of their expenses back then as well. As I mentioned, the believers in ancient Macedonia used some of their fellowship funds to help cover Paul's expenses whenever he was going around the gospel. They actually, out of their poverty, helped pay for Paul's mission. And particularly whenever he was in prison. They would send not only stuff to get him around, but they would send food to him, they'd send people to him, and they were saying, like, man, we gotta help this guy out. After they took care of themselves and they took care of Paul, they still figured out a way to give out of their poverty to those that they heard about who were suffering. They were really a generous people. And their story is sort of inspiring. And sometimes their story is a little guilt-ridden, going like, man, I could do that back then, and I'm better off than they are, and I'm not living up to Macedonia's level. What Paul did in reporting about the Macedonians to the Corinthians reveals some important principles when it comes to giving. The amount that they gave was weighed against their ability to give. You remember that time whenever the Pharisee at the temple in Jerusalem was making a big deal about all the money that he was giving to alms, that is a specific offering that was going to go and help the poor. He was making this big show of it. He was, hey, I'm here and I'm giving the money. Look how much I'm giving in here, and getting everybody to watch it. And Jesus says, you see that guy? You see how much he's given? He was given a whole bunch. Because that guy's really not given anything. You see this little woman over here who's got nothing, and she's given a mite, a little copper coin, a coin that wouldn't have fed anybody, because she's given everything she has. He compared the two. out of the abundance they have and how they gave and why they gave. And Paul was doing the same sort of thing. He wanted them to understand that there was a time when our giving needed to be sacrificial. And those little coins, when they're added together, can do an awful lot. Paul indicates that the Macedonian believers had somehow, he doesn't tell us what it was, but they developed some sort of efficient system to collect and distribute their generosity. And he points out to the Corinthians in this letter that, hey, you remember when I first challenged you and you got all excited about it, that Titus was with me? Well, Titus has been in Macedonia, and he's been helping them, and he's been infected with generosity, and I'm going to send him back so he can infect you with generosity, and he's going to help spur you on to do what you want to do. Paul then reminded the believers in Corinth that Titus was going to be able to do this for them. Sometimes we need a champion. Sometimes we have the desire. Sometimes we have the resources. But we just don't have that person who's going like, hey man, let's go get it. Let's go do this thing. And Titus was going to be that person for the church in Corinth. They needed that. Titus wasn't showing up to get them to do something they didn't want to do. He was showing up to resource them to do the very thing they said they wanted to do. And they really did want to. They just were struggling with it. He actually says, I'm going to send him to see you so that you can prove your love. Not like they're trying to show it off or anything, but just get your love out of your mouth, get it out of your heart, get it out of your feelings, and get it into your wallet, and get it going on. I remember one time whenever I was training to go into ministry, and I was being taught about baptism. And he says, you know, when you get someone in there, they're always really concerned about everything that's going to get wet. You know, we use immersion and you get there. He goes, whenever you take that person you baptize, make sure their wallet is in their pocket. We want that thing baptized too. You know, when we come up, we don't being generous and stuff, you know. You get the idea. There's got to be a change in us from being like the world to being more like Christ. Christ is an amazing example of generosity. And in our text, Paul holds up Christ as the example that we're supposed to be following. But if you recall, it's an example that rich young ruler was unwilling to follow whenever Jesus challenged him. Because you want to come and be my disciple? Go give away all your stuff to the poor. Come follow me. And the guy said, you can't do that. You're asking too much. When you have riches, when you have an abundance of riches, it's hard to let go of them. We get used to having them. Jesus said it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle, an impossibility, right? Than to get a rich man to stop worshiping his money. He said you just can't have two masters. You can't have two lords. You'll love one, you'll hate the other. And generosity evidences who you really love. It answers who is really your Lord. And it doesn't matter how much or how little you have. If you're following Jesus, you're going to be generous. You're going to be giving. Comparing ourselves to Christ is hard because we just don't really measure up to him. But it does get us moving in the right direction. Paul said that Christ became poor that we might become rich, implying that giving like Christ, the believers in Corinth were going to become poor. And the poor in Jerusalem would become rich. I want you to pay special attention to what Paul said in verse 13, where Paul emphasized that this effort was not so the saints in Jerusalem might be relieved by getting squeezed and the believers, squeezing the believers in Corinth, but it was to be an expression of God's kind of equality. Paul was making clear that this was not a restitution payment. It wasn't a social justice transfer of wealth kind of thing. The goal was generosity. The goal of generosity is not to punish those who have or to forcibly take away what they have. To be really honest, poor people don't deserve getting extra. Generosity is seeing that they need and being moved by compassion to do something about it because you realize they're hurting. And they have needs. and you can help. Generosity is giving to those who don't deserve. It's giving to alleviate their suffering. And for the Corinthian believers in ancient Corinth, it was giving to these believers they'd never met in Jerusalem. Just hearing about their plight and being moved by it and saying, I can do something about that. I don't know those guys from Adam. They don't deserve my money, but I'm willing to give it to them because, man, look what's happening to them. Paul points out that at that time, the believers in Corinth had an abundance of wealth. Can you imagine having an abundance of wealth? You just got too much. And they really did want to help the believers in Jerusalem who had no wealth. But Paul indicated in this section, as I said before, that something was going on and they didn't know what to do. But Paul also points out, he says, these believers who don't have wealth in Jerusalem, they do have an abundance. I wish he would have specified what they had an abundance of, because he doesn't do that. But he does say that they're going to be sending their abundance to what the Corinthians were lacking. I mean, they had an abundance of wealth. But I wonder what the Corinthians were lacking that the Jerusalem church had an abundance of. They were lacking wealth, but they had abundance of something else that was being sent to help those in Corinth. I usually think it's probably like evangelists. Maybe it was preachers. They had an abundance of preachers. And they were just like, man, we got to get rid of some of these guys. We got too many of these guys around here. Corinth, they don't have preachers. We're going to send some to Corinth. Get rid of these guys. That's how Paul ended up there. They had an abundance of people who knew Jesus. They had an abundance of people who knew the gospel. They had an abundance of people who knew what it was to hold on to your faith when you're persecuted. They had an abundance of people who were willing to follow the Spirit and use the gifts of the Spirit. And that was sort of lacking in Corinth. And so even though they had abundance, they could share with lacking, they went both directions. Paul's saying, that's God's kind of equality. Everybody has an abundance. I want you to think about that. I want you to think about what kind of abundance has God put in your life. Now, I want to remind you again that Paul's motivations for writing this portion of the letter was because he knew the abundance of Corinth, and he wanted to help them rise up to this challenge. He didn't want them to fail in the grace of giving. He wanted them to be generous people. Sometimes when we look at our lives, we think, man, I really can't help because I don't have enough to give. But it might be, it's not that we don't have enough to give. It's that we use our abundance on ourselves, and we use it so much that we don't have anything left over. We have an abundance, but we're spending it all on ourselves. I can't give to the Lord. I got that new car, and I just don't have anything extra. I can't give to the Lord's work. I know that there's some really needs there, but that new phone. I had to get that new phone, and it was only $4,000. But it kind of tapped me out. I just can't give right now. I really can't go to the Lord. I've got to go out to eat, and my entertainment budget is just to keep me. And I got to have that in my life, and it's just more, and I just don't have anything left. I'm saving for that vacation. We've always wanted to go on this vacation, and we've just been putting a little back, putting a little back, putting a little back. And I'd like to give. It's a really big thing there, but we just don't have any extra. I can't give the Lord. You got the idea, right? I got to be the dean of his camps lots of times earlier in my ministry, and I was the dean of a high school camp. And we got them together. And this particular camp I was at was known for not having any real measurable means of offering for missionaries. And so we were always kind of come up with some creative way to actually get these kids to give to support the missionaries. One of the things we did, we actually had a missionary sacrifice. We were trying to figure it out, and so we decided to sacrifice a missionary in good missionary style. And so we auctioned off all the leftovers out of the kitchen. And we told them that we were going to put the missionary on a table, and if they raised enough money to buy these leftovers, they could spread them all over the missionary. And they started buying all kinds of, we didn't know where that money was coming. They spent a lot of money. It was so good, we said, you know what? If you buy even more, we'll throw the dean in, which was me. Let me tell you, kids will spend a lot to smear stuff on the dean of the camp. We raised a tremendous amount of money. But one of the other things that we decided to do with them was just sort of challenge them. So you guys have come here to count, and you don't think you have anything, but maybe you really do. Maybe you're just spending your abundance. Do you really need a Coke and a candy bar every time the canteen is open, and we open it twice a day? And of course, they always had money for canteen. Could you just go with one Coke today? Could you just go maybe with one candy bar today? And it was amazing. Our canteen sales almost dropped to nothing now. They started giving, in fact, we gave little cards to some of them couldn't be trusted with their money, and so we had like canteen cards, or parents could buy a card, and they would just have the card. And we said, this week, if you want to give your card in the offering, you can do that. Just take it and go in the offering, and we'll figure that out. And those kids were so generous when they realized, you know what? We do have an abundance. We got a lot. Now we took pity on them, and we put out extra snacks so they could get some food. We didn't want them, dropping off on us without having enough sugar in their life. So we took care of that for them. But it was a reminder to all of us who were sponsors, because we'd been challenging those kids all week about how much to give. And then at night when we were talking about it, you're like, what about us? We've been challenging these kids and they've been giving, but how about us and staff? Have we been putting anything in? I know we're just a bunch of youth ministers that, barely make it from check to check the little churches that we're at. But we have an abundance too, don't we? And so we challenged each other, and we made one of the larger offerings that time, not to brag on us, but it was just a reminder of, you know what? We've been spending our abundance on ourselves. And is that really why God gave us an abundance? So what's your excuse for not being generous? What's your excuse for not really fellowshipping with the church like they did in the ancient days? For not expressing the grace of God? For not showing the love of Christ? For not willing to become poor that others might become rich? For not being moved by compassion? If you just kind of got scars on it and you just can't be compassionate anymore because you've been taken advantage of. Like I said, I want you to take some inventory today. How has God supplied you in abundance? He wants you to use that abundance to take care of those who are lacking. He gave it to you for a reason. And when you're looking through that, you might even find some things in your life that you're lacking. You may say, I may have a whole lot of this, but man, I don't have any of that. And it may be that during this inventory, someone else near you might realize that they have a bunch of that they need. That's God's equality, that we learn to share with one another, and we learn to recognize each other's lacking, and we learn to realize God has given us abundance, and we share with one another, and then we take it beyond us to share with others. But don't forget those Macedonians who gave from their poverty. Generosity is enhanced by abundance. But it is not limited to abundance. We're to express our compassion. We're to be generous, even if it calls on us to make a sacrifice. I'll be honest with our church. I've always been impressed with the generosity of our church. We've had a very generous church. I've been here now 25 years, and I've seen so many needs presented, and I've seen so many people give abundantly. We have a reputation for being generous. And I want us to continue on with that reputation, not living on what people have done in the past, but giving because we've learned to be generous. And we have caught it, and we've become contagious, that others might see us and become just as generous. We really can be generous. We really can follow Jesus' example. We really can excel in the grace of giving. I'm going to ask our worship team to come forward for our closing song. And I want to close by reminding you that God is the one who supplied everything you have. He is the one. He's given you abundance. It's not because you are so good. It's because God is so good. And I want to challenge you to become generous just as he is. Would you please stand?